Earlier this spring, I had a program that had to do with the Deschutes Waterway, also known as Capitol Lake. And one of the options was one way of dealing with that in the future. And today, we have the other main option that is being proposed to deal with that, which is different than the one that we heard a couple of months ago. So I would like to have our program, who's Dave Peeler. I'm going to tell you a little bit about Dave. Is born and raised in Seattle, went to the University of Washington, got his BS in zoology and English literature. Later studied environmental policy and science at Evergreen State College. He worked for the Washington Department of Ecology for 33 years in areas of water resources, water quality, shorelines management, Puget Sound restoration, holding also many positions including water quality program manager and special assistant to the director. His work included water quality standards, water quality monitoring, water discharge permits, non-point pollution source control programs, grants and loan for water pollution prevention and control, and watershed pollution control plans and water resources. Well, that's a mouthful, isn't it? Got a lot of background experience. Subsequent to his initial retirement in 2008, he held various positions. One was independent consultant, also director of policy at the nonprofit People for Puget Sound, is analyst for Puget Sound Partnership, assisting the formation of Puget Sound Ecosystem Monitoring Program, and he finally retired totally in 2015. He's president of the board of the Deschutes Estuary Restoration Team and president of the board of the Scott Lake Homeowners Association, past board member of the Griffin Neighborhood Association, and past president of Olympia Kiwanis Club. So let's welcome Dave Peeler and hear another viewpoint, another option to what to do with Capitol Lake now.
Well, in talking with the folks at my table here from the Rotary Club, I already know, and you already know, that there's something about retirement that doesn't allow you to actually retire. And so it's kind of a misnomer to think about that, because we all have doing this wonderful, volunteer work like you're doing here at the Rotary Club. And I will make one caution. I left my phone on because I'm expecting my second grandson to be born any day now, and I'm the backup for the first grandson. And we mentioned I was president of Kiwanis a couple years ago, Olympia Kiwanis Club, and we do joint meetings with the West Olympia Rotary several times a year, so we're pretty familiar with Rotary, and very happy to do projects with them as well. We also have a team in the Relay for Life, and we'll also be helping out at the marathon at a water stop as well. So it's interesting how many things the clubs do sort of jointly, but we don't necessarily know that. I will point out that we now sponsor, the Olympia Kiwanis Club, the Olympia Harbor Days, which happens on Labor Day weekend. We took over in running that event several years ago, and it's coming up again this year, so please come down and attend it and have a great time. And I left on your tables something called a Watershed Guide, and this is something that the organization I represent today put together a year or so ago. And one of the things that we found out when we started doing outreach about the Capitol Lake and the Deschutes watershed was that a lot of people, including in Olympia here, didn't actually realize there's a river that flows into that lake. And part of that is because most of that river is really not available for public access. There's no road that drives along the river like along Snoqualmie and some other rivers in our state. So you get little snatches of it here and there at parks, and that's pretty much it. So we wanted to be able to show the entire watershed and kind of give a history of what's gone on in there, and that's really what this tries to do. So I left a lot of those on the tables. I didn't know how many to rank, so probably not enough for everybody. Page down. Didn't work. Okay, so what do you do here? Page down here.
Should be like, I think left or right key, arrow key.
Okay, try something else. There we go. Got it. Okay, so most of you have probably seen this photo. It's in a lot of businesses around town. I don't really know the date of that, but it's interesting, and that was, of course, before the dredging occurred, before the before the dam was put in, right there, where there's an old wooden bridge there in this photo. And you can see the Port Peninsula is much smaller than it is today, and the East Bay area went way up there where the creek used to flow in there. And boats could actually get in all the way up to the old brewery there. Here's another shot taken from the west side of Olympia looking across towards what's now downtown. In fact, you can see the old Capitol there. And there's a wooden bridge, it's a drawbridge that used to allow boats to get in and up and down, mostly to the brewery, but there also were mills up in that area, you might recall. In fact, if you walk along the trail that goes along the Tumwater Falls, you can still see some of the old flumes bring water in to power the mills that were there. Here's another shot, and I actually just took this in a doctor's office here a couple days ago, so I did note that it's from the Susan Parrish collection here. And this is actually what was known as Little Hollywood, so these are all the businesses and floating homes and whatnot that used to line the old estuary there before the dam was built. And there's the state capitol, of course, up above there. The reason I show this is when we talk about why the dam was actually built and the lake created, one of the things that happened after World War II was, let's get rid of all these old shanty towns that were around that sprung up during the Depression. And of course there were workers, mill workers and others that lived here as well, but also there was a lot of immigrants in these areas. And they were vacated forcefully from this area. Those were burned, and then the dam was created and flooded everything out. So we have a history here that's not all roses, but it's interesting. The other thing, one reason I show this is that there are people who actually were here before the dam was built. So I'm not one of them. I wasn't here before the 1950s. Literally, I was born in 1951. But there was a lot of concern about odors emanating from this area. And one reason I mention that, of course, there probably wasn't any treatment to any of the sewage coming off of these businesses. And including before 1951, there was no treatment at all for the city of Olympia. We had pipes that brought sewage and industrial waste into the waters, but there was no treatment. Of course, that's the old Olympia brew house, where they used to be able to actually bring barges and ships right up to their quay there. And they can't anymore because over the 50 years, 60, 70 years since the dam was built, there's been some sedimentation, and you can see the bottom of the falls there. By the way, we fully support it. Would be great if there was a way to redevelop that property into something that would benefit the city of Tumwater. Now we look at today, and in the summertime, good thing you do your duck dash in early June, because a little bit later, this is what it looks like on the lake. We get these big algal mats, high temperatures in the water, algal mats, low dissolved oxygen, pretty bad looking stuff, and not very good for fish and wildlife. And of course, the lake is closed because of the exotic species, invasive species that are in there, so there's no public access whatsoever. And it's interesting, you guys can drop your ducks in there and have to pull them out again, but one of the things you have to worry about is, are you taking some invasive species with you when you remove those? As long as you're not putting them in some other water body, it's probably not a problem. But if people want to get on there, for instance, one of our members wanted to do some sampling, you have to get special permission from the state. You have to follow certain procedures to make sure you're not moving those species around. The creation of the lake, 1949, the Deschutes Basin Appropriation Bill passed the state legislature. The dam was completed in 1951, and it's interesting that very first summer, that's when we first got the big algae blooms on the lake. So it's not necessarily a recent phenomenon. It's been there all along. The parkway was built along the west side of the lake here for transportation, and of course the dam became a bridge, nice concrete bridge to the west side of Olympia. No drawbridge, so no more water access up to the brewery. And then, but in that same time, as I just mentioned, the first Olympia sewage treatment plant was built in the 1950s. Brewery began their wastewater treatment in those same years, and then of course the I-5 freeway was built across. And you see, there's no freeway here. This photo is taken before their freeway was built. And of course, by now I have a later photo that shows Heritage Park. It's a little different situation there. So. One of the things that happened was there was a couple of big dredgings in the lake to remove sediments that accumulated, and then back in the 1980s there was a proposal that got put on hold because of controversy around it. And so the state created this group called CLAMP. I don't know if you've heard this from the previous speaker or not. Capital Lake Adaptive Management Program. It involved local governments and state agencies in looking at the different proposals and what to do with the lake. They reviewed 4 alternatives, keep it as a lake, restore an estuary, something called a hybrid, and no action. And their reports and final recommendations came in, were submitted in 2009, and they actually spent quite a bit of money, and there's quite a bit of good technical work that was done by consultants at that time. Their conclusion, majority conclusion, was most cost effective to remove the dam and restore the estuary. Of course, no action has been taken either to do that or to dredge the lake or anything else since then. So the situation certainly has not improved, and if anything, it's gotten worse. Restoration has been historically opposed by the port, by the Olympia Yacht Club, by some private marinas that are nearby, and by city's beautiful supporters who formed CLIPA. Not showing the bottom of that slide. And then, because of course that's the most important point for me, which was, and then DERT, the group that I represent here today, the Deschutes Estuary Restoration Team, was formed after CLIPA was formed to sort of support restoration of the estuary. So a little bit of what's happened here in the last couple of years. Everyone knows state works on a biennial budget 2 years at a time, and we're fast approaching the end of this biennium, and that's why we have to have a new budget passed. So not the current biennium, but the previous biennium, the Department of Enterprise Services, which is a state agency that manages Capitol Lake and the Capitol campus and other state properties across the state, business properties, I should say, offices, that sort of thing. They hired a consultant with some money that the legislature appropriated for them to review the dredging permit process and timelines. And that consultant was an outfit called Floyd Snyder. They provided a list of the kind of permit approvals and permits needed, along with a flow chart and a timeline if you did want to do a dredging of the lake. And the reason this is important is no matter which alternative in the future is chosen, we're going to have to dredge some of those sediments out of the current lake. So that if you open up the estuary again, you don't want this slug of sediments just coming down, so you want to dredge some of that. If you keep it as a lake, you're going to want to do some dredging as well. The projected timeline to get approvals was somewhere between 18 and 24 months once you started to apply for permits, and they put a big caveat on that: if no environmental impact statement is required. I had to sort of laugh when I saw that, because I can't imagine they could ever get permits in this day and age without doing an EIS. And I'll come back to that in a moment. The likelihood of receiving permits is also very low to maybe nil without a final project plan. And to date, there is no project plan. So it's like, you want to dredge for what purpose is kind of what the agencies are asking. And how will we know that this fits that purpose if there is no plan? Also, the dredging spoils these days are very expensive to dispose of due to the invasive species that are in the lake, such as New Zealand mud snail, purple loosestrife, and others. So that they must all be disposed of at an upland site away from water, so that anything that's in there doesn't get into some other water body. So the current biennium, so that report was done a couple of years ago, and then this biennium, the legislature appropriated some additional funds to the state Department of Enterprise Services, and they hired the same consultant to help them with the process for some initial scoping of what's known as hybrid options, other options that might come up, and then to also look at some options for governance and funding, and then report that to the legislature. Their process to date, it's actually finished. I forgot to update this part of that slide. They finished their report and submitted it to the legislature in December. And in my opinion, at least, as a person who tried to participate in that process, it was pretty open and deliberate. And of course, Bill McGregor was heavily involved in that on the executive committee. He's here, and he could give his own opinion on it. But the meetings of the executive committee that they formed, which was a group of local governments, the tribe, and Department of Enterprise Services, which I call DES, those meetings were open to the public. They met monthly for about a year. But they didn't take any public comments at those meetings, which was something I kind of objected to. They had two subcommittees. They had a technical committee that included those same local governments in the tribe, but also some state agencies like Ecology and Department of Natural Resources and maybe Fish and Wildlife, I can't recall. Those meetings were open to the public. Couldn't comment, but they were open. And then the Governance and Funding Committee included local governments, the tribe, and DES only, and those meetings were closed to the public, which was one of the things that I thought was unfortunate. And one reason I thought that was unfortunate was because we have some thoughts on future opportunities to help defray some of the costs for the agencies like the Corps and the Yacht Club, etc., to help with sort of having to deal with a more frequent dredging that they might have to do in the future. So DERT and CLIPA, the two sides of the advocates here, we were both allowed to make presentations to that executive work group back in June last year. And the work group and committee meetings, as I said, are all completed. They filed their report in mid-December to the legislature. They did include some cost estimates, although those kept going back and forth because the folks that represent CLIPA kept changing what their proposal was. So I didn't update that bullet point with the final numbers, but at least it showed that the estuary option in the long term was the least costly. Currently, or recently, the DES did request $5.5 million in the capital budget for next biennium starting in July to conduct an EIS process, an environmental impact statement process, and undertake some technical studies to fill some gaps in the technical knowledge. And one of those big gaps has to do with the U.S. Geological Survey did some work back for that CLAMP committee several years ago dealing with sedimentation and hydrology. And that work needs to be updated and some more specific, since we have some specific proposals on the table now to sort of do some hydrology and computer modeling to get a better handle on the sedimentation issues. And that's expensive, that kind of modeling. So the proposed House capital budget, so no budgets are passed, right? You guys all know that. But on the capital side, so there's an operating budget, the one that pays for schools mostly, and a capital budget that pays for construction of new schools, but also lots of other capital projects. The proposed House capital budget has $2 million. Remember, they asked for $5.5 million. It's got $2 million in it for NEIS and work on Capitol Lake and Deschutes Estuary. The Senate budget that passed the Senate has $3 million in their budget proposal, but it has a huge caveat. It requires a substantial local match, a match equal to that $3 million. Well, to me, that's a killer. I don't see the local governments and the port and so on coming up with $3 million. Bill, you haven't come up with $3 million lately, have you? Yeah, I didn't think so.
You don't have the checkbook with me.
Yeah, okay. So we're really concerned about that. So we're hoping that in the final budget that goes through the conference committee in the legislature, and that won't happen, of course, until they agree on an operating budget as well for schools, that they will, iron out this difference, but also remove that local match requirement. And I haven't had a conversation with the Department of Enterprise Services since these budgets were passed about what can you do with $2 million when you ask for $5 million, that kind of a thing. So I'm not really sure what that means to them. What I suspect what it might mean is they'll get started on this project and come back and ask for more money in the following biennium. So a little bit on the need for restoration. Here's a kind of an overhead shot showing those same algal mats. And again, here's the completed heritage park that wasn't in the previous photo. Capitol Lake, according to the work done by the state Department of Ecology, has the largest impact on Clean Water Act violations on Bud Inlet. And I could have added 2016, there's another technical report out. And it has, as I said, several invasive species in there that have taken up residence in the lake here. And it's one of the top priorities for habitat restoration by the Puget Sound Partnership, which is a big agency set up for restoration and protection of Puget Sound. A couple of technical slides. I apologize for this. This is what I used to do for my bread and butter. But what the Department of Ecology did was, with the data that they had from monitoring and some computer models, is they put together a computer model to run through, starting in February through kind of the summer months, the natural conditions. What would the water body look like if you didn't have a dam, you didn't have discharges like the lot treatment plant and so on that contribute to water quality problems. So that's basically taking out the discharges and the dam. And then there's the water quality standard for Bud Inlet right there. So you can see natural conditions are better than the standard all the year really. But then here's the existing conditions, and starting in right after maybe mid-June, but this is over a number of years. So and then all the way through September, and they didn't run this out, but probably the same thing happens in October and November depending on the year and how warm it is. Water quality goes way below the water quality standard. So the next thing they did was they said, well, what if you started removing in the computer model different contributions like the wastewater treatment plants and Bud Inlet? If you remove the non-point pollution coming in, that's running off of stormwater, streets, farms, that sort of thing. And external pollution sources, and external means coming from outside South Puget Sound. Let's say there's some really big wastewater treatment plants in Tacoma area, Pierce County and City of Tacoma. Some of that waste we know from the work that's been done actually comes all the way down in the marine waters and enters into Bud Inlet. So if you take some of that out, and it's not a large, hugely significant effect, but it's there. Then where are you at? And you can see each one of these, you remove them, you get down a little bit closer to meeting the standard, but here's the big one. This is the dam right here. So in essence, you have to remove the dam. It's by far the largest contributor to poor water quality of Bud Inlet. Here's another way of looking at it. Kind of, you can see the proportionality of the different contributions. The dam, the wastewater treatment plants, and that includes a lot plus 3 very small treatment plants, like at the Tamashan and a couple of others. Non-point pollution, and then here's, these are the external pollution sources, the big wastewater treatment plants and non-point outside of Bud Inlet. This is the wastewater treatment plants in Bud Inlet. So you can see their contribution is relatively small overall to the problem here. The problem is ecology is working on a water quality cleanup plan for Bud Inlet, Capitol Lake. They've already completed one for the Deschutes River above the falls, and that's waiting at EPA for approval. And this one, they've completed most of the work on the marine waters in Capitol Lake, but isn't yet completed, and the advisory committee will start meeting on this here later this month. But under the Federal Clean Water Act, if they don't manage to put a plan into place to correct the water quality problem in Bud Inlet, these guys take most of the brunt of the problem because they're point source discharges that require wastewater discharge permits, and yet they're probably the least impactful on the problem. That's just the way, unfortunately, the law works, because the Clean Water Act doesn't have good controls over non-point pollution, and as far as we know, doesn't really have a direct control over whether you have a dam or not across the river here. So, although that might be tested. So, restoration proposal. Much of the estuary course has been filled in over time. I mentioned already the Port Peninsula is quite a bit larger than it was originally. Downtown Olympia, a lot of it's built on fill. Heritage Park, there was quite a bit of fill. The isthmus area that we call it, where the dam is, of course, is quite a bit of fill. Rail and freeway crossings, the Deschutes Parkway, they're all built on fill there. But having said that, you could still restore 260 acres of marine habitat there. And that marine habitat is incredibly important for juvenile salmonids coming downstream and adult salmonids returning upstream. Removal of the dam would result in about a 500-foot wide opening, and that would equal filling a critical need, as I mentioned, for estuarine habitat for adult salmon and juvenile salmon and meeting water quality standard. And opportunities have been identified to help limit the impacts of sedimentation loading that might happen downstream, and that's part of what we need to model with the technical studies that the state would like to fund. Getting close to closing here. Capitol Lake is really a dammed estuary. And when you think about lakes around Thurston County, you might think about, Long Lake or Lake Lawrence and different lakes around here. And some of those are natural. Some of them have been raised a bit through some sort of a dam or a water level gate at the outlet. But that's not what Capitol Lake is. Capitol Lake is you took a river at its mouth and basically put a dam across it. That's way different from any other lake in our state. And because of that, we can get federal matching funds for the restoration part of that, up to 75% through the Corps of Engineers. Once restored, there of course would have to be continued dredging of one kind or another, but it would be somewhat limited. We think it's a fiscally conservative fix. It would bring life back to the Bud Inlet and support new fish hatchery upstream at Pioneer Park. I didn't mention that, but the state budget also has an appropriation for $20 million to build a new fish hatchery at Pioneer Park in Tumwater. Well, those fish have to go through what is now the horrible conditions in the lake. So increased salmon and recreational opportunities. I think if you put the salt water back in the estuary, we're going to be able to have recreation once again in that area. And of course, it would address Clean Water Act violations. A couple more comments. The Capitol Campus Reflecting Pool vision was created by architects and landscapers, but these guys weren't hydrologists, and they certainly weren't ecosystem experts. So I don't think they really envisioned what could happen, 60, 70 years later when you put that dam in. But we have recognized, since the 1970s, some of these excesses where we didn't think things through particularly well for the environment, and we're starting to remedy those, including down at the Squally or over at Elwha River. And indications are that creation of the lake at the mouth of the river was and is, in our opinion, an ecological disaster. So let's look for better solutions in the future and not keep repeating the mistakes of the past. And it's not quite our logo, but we did add this word that one of our members coined a couple of years ago, estuary, yes to the estuary. And then here's an artist's rendition of people kayaking under a bridge up into the new estuary. And on a very nonpartisan note, since I'm sure you all would agree with me that the best university in the state. So I don't know, John, do we have a few minutes?
Yeah, let's take a couple of questions. We have some time for just a couple of questions. Start with Bill and then go to Colleen.
Just a couple of things, and next week we're going to have a little lesson on Australian mud snails and the New Zealand mud snails. But everything that the club uses that's in the water, we have Fish and Wildlife on site now at the old boat launch, and they'll be processing and cleaning anything that comes out. The ducks actually get bagged up and are pulled out to a dry land area that are laid out to dry for 5 to 7 days, and hopefully we're going to have sunny weather, but it has to be about 70 degrees or hotter for the ducks to dry out, and then we go through each one of them, take the numbers off, and look for anything that might be attached to them. So the club's very aware of the impact that the mud snail has had and does have even on our use of.
And I figured you were, because there's no way the state can just let people in and out of there
You
anymore.
have to get clearance every year and all that stuff.
Yeah.
The other comment I wanted to make was that I want to make sure people understand that in 2009, the port passed a resolution that our concern with anything that happens up in Capitol Lake is the sediment issue, because as you know, down in Bud Inlet, we have a lot of legacy pollution that we're trying to work with DOE to get cleaned up. And as sediment comes down from the lake, it may be clean when it gets into Bud Inlet. Once it settles down on top of the legacy pollution, now we've got that much more dirty dirt to get rid of, because once it gets mixed, you can't do that. So that's one of the issues the port has, is what are we going to do with sediment that comes down? We've got to be able to handle that. Or we'll be dredging every 1 to 2 years. And that gets nothing but expensive.
Yeah, and Bill has a good point there. And a couple of things about that. One is, as Bill indicates, there's still pollution coming off from the Port Peninsula area that then migrates into the sediments along the shipping terminals. And then when that's cleaned up, it's pretty expensive to dispose of. And then what's interesting about in some other estuaries in our state, like up in Tacoma and Commencement Bay, where they've had similar cleanup problems, they have dredged out the contaminated sediments or upland soils down to some depth, and then they've used clean fill on top of that. And so because what we have coming down our rivers today, like in the Deschutes, is actually way cleaner than what's in the bay generally. And so the stuff coming down is cleaner. And I think Bill's point is, if you mix it, then you just have more, and it's mixed up to the point where it's contaminated, then you've got more of the contaminated stuff to dispose of. So part of the thinking is you have to do this in a way that doesn't result in that. And I agree with Bill.
Great. And my last comment, if I can, the budgetary thing that we're going through now is they're figuring that if they do an EIS, it's going to take anywhere from at least 36 months on the front side, but it could be longer. So that's why they're trying to break it up into 2 biennium budgets, and how they wrestle with that, we'll have to see how that plays out. But thanks for your presentation today.
Yeah, thank you, Bill. And the thing about having worked for a state agency, when you go to ask for money, and the legislature says, well, can we break it up over two budgets? And I'm sure the port has the same issue, which is, well, it's great to get the money for the first part of it, but is there a guarantee you'll get it for the second part? Well, no, because something might happen. We might have a recession, who knows? So there's not as much guarantee that way, but it is a way to fund these things over a longer period of time, and that happens a lot in state government. Am I supposed to be kicking? You have a question?
Well, with the dam removal, how do you address flooding of downtown Olympia?
Yeah, the flooding issue is an interesting one, because and in fact, we saw recently when we had the high tides that the dam actually didn't make any difference there. Part of that is depending on if the state has DES that manages the dam, if they have enough advance notice, let's say from the weatherman, that we're going to have heavy rainfall, we might have heavy floods or a rain on snow event when we have those rare events. If they can lower the lake down, then they can control a little bit of the flooding, but not all of it. And it's amazing how quickly that lake fills up when the river's running at full blast. And if you've ever been down there at the falls during flood stage, the river doesn't have really the lake doesn't have that much volume in it. It never did, but it has less now with the sediments in there. So it only, according to the study that I've seen, it gives them maybe 20 minutes of extra flood control from the river, i.e. water coming down the river. And it really doesn't do much at all for high tides anymore, because if you go down there on one of our super high tides, they call them the king tides, you will see seawater flowing over the dam into the lake already. So I'm not on the concrete part you drive on, but where the boards are down below, because it's not high enough to stop that from happening. So we're already starting to see some problems with the current dam setup, but I think that will get worse as sea level continues to rise.
One more question, then we gotta wrap up.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I have a question about something that I don't know if any of the proposals have accounted for this or not. It's probably a hard thing to measure, but the amount of recreation that goes on at Capitol Lake right now,
Yeah.
I think that, I guess, try to phrase this correctly, but the health benefits for people, I think are really great. Having an area like that, not a lot of cities have an area where, I mean, there's always people walking around no matter what the weather. And you know, I think it would be really sad, and I think a lot of maybe the cost benefits might get offset if you have less areas for people to be active and walk.
Yeah, so, you know, we've looked at that issue because it is an issue that's raised by opponents of the estuary restoration, and we've looked at that issue about recreation and tourism dollars in Olympia. And the unfortunate fact is, yes, you see a lot of people, including me, walking around the lake. You know, that's a great way to get out there and get some exercise and, you know, just to be outside. But we actually are very, very low on the tourism dollar expenditure here in Olympia compared to almost any other place in our state, including almost any other place in the Northwest, not just our state. And so, you know, there's a lot of work to be done to bring more tourism dollars in. But the other thing is, you look at what's actually happened with recreation in some of the areas that have been restored, like in the Squally Delta or the Elwha River and so on. The recreation, number of people who recreate has gone up by anywhere from 5 to 10-fold in those areas. So we don't really think it's going to decrease here. If anything, it'll probably go up. And the thing about an estuary, in my opinion, is that it changes all the time. So you have marine waters flooding in and flooding out, high tides, low tides, and everything in between, and different kinds of animal critters that use it at different tide levels. And so it's a very kind of an ecosystem that actually has its own interest in it because of that fact. And so what we've seen in these other areas is actually a lot more people going down to use them. But I mean, that's something that the state could study as part of the CIS process. Is that it?
I think
Okay.
that's it. So Dave, as part of our tradition, we ask you to sign a book, and you can take this and do it at the table, that we will then donate to the South Sound Reading Foundation in your name. So I got lucky. I got a book, 1 fish, 2 fish, red fish, blue fish.